Julia Christine Edwards was not prepared for the situation that was unfolding across the world. Last night, everything had been normal. At least, as normal as it usually was in politics. Then at 3 a.m., she was awakened by her chief of staff, who informed her in no uncertain terms that something had just entered low Earth orbit. Within minutes, she was in the Situation Room, watching a monitor which displayed the 5 sleek craft in formation above the planet. The Secretary of Defense, John Abril, normally a prim and proper man, looked completely disheveled. "Ma'am," he had said to her, "we have several first contact scenarios prepared. As of yet, no one outside of NATO has any idea they're up there. Except maybe the Chinese, but who knows what they know." After a moment, the President of the United States glanced away from the monitors at her SecDef. "John," she said simply. "Bring every asset we have online." He nodded, relieved that she hadn't left the decision up to him. It was cool inside the Situation Room, but John Abril's brow was covered in sweat. The Secretary of Defense had gotten even less sleep than the Commander-in-Chief. In fact, he had just laid down for the night next to his wife. John called her the Hog when a call had caused his cell phone to light up. Since answering it, he wondered if he'd ever be able to sleep again. "She'll probably sleep through the end of the world," he reflected on his wife, half in disgust and half in affection. A fine line of distinction that only a long-married couple can achieve. She was almost certainly blissfully unaware the end of the world had come. With that thought, John Abril turned to leave the Situation Room. It was nearly time for him to meet and brief the 2 guests that he planned to bring before the president. They might be the only shot the United States would have to stop these things. "I want a full report of probable capabilities and intentions in 20 minutes, President Edwards said to no one in particular. President Edwards was not a wartime president. She had ran on education reform and a promise of a brighter future for a faltering nation. There had been so many setbacks, the collapse of the Russian Federation, the dissolution of the European Union, and then the unification of Mongolia, Siberia, and North Korea under Chinese hegemony. The world was a changed place. Now, 7 hours later, it had changed again. First Beijing, and then Tokyo, London, and now Los Angeles were destroyed. NATO was scrambling to mount a counterattack, but the questions of where and how to do so had no easy answers. Then there was the other question, one that filled Julia Edwards with fear. Can these aliens even be defeated? Certainly, they weren't here to have a discussion. There had been several attempts at communication. So far, only silence and annihilation had been offered as answers. The situation was now bordering on catastrophe. 60 fighters and an entire fleet no longer existed. 170 cruise missiles had been launched at the warship while it was still over what remained of Los Angeles. The only noticeable result was a deep pockmark on the ship's underbelly. Julia's advisors had told her that it was the result of a pilot using his own ship as a missile. The same trick didn't work twice. From that point forward, the turrets on the warship hadn't let anything airborne within a mile of its gleaming hull. Initial reports from NATO said the same for the craft that had just leveled London. Now the alien craft over California was nearing San Francisco, moving slowly and deliberately toward its next target. 3 more vessels just like it were over Mumbai, Berlin, and Manila. The 5th one, a larger craft, hovered motionlessly in orbit. Things were getting out of hand very rapidly. The world was waking up to chaos on an unprecedented scale. President Edwards would have to give a speech very soon. It was her duty to keep the United States united even in trying times. She did not relish the thought. There would be little good news to offer. "Madam President," her chief of staff interrupted her thoughts. "We just received word that the Chinese just launched 100 nuclear ICBMs at the warship over Manila." The president looked up at her advisor through thick-rimmed glasses. She still needed to find the time to have corrective surgery for her nearsightedness. Lines deepened across her face, which was not nearly as youthful as it had looked 5 years prior on the televisions of millions of her countrymen. "Without informing us first?" she asked incredulously. "Well, ma'am, we're not even sure who's in charge anymore," Hillary said, glancing back down at the datapad that fed her a constant stream of updates. Beijing had been leveled before the Chinese could even be contacted about the possible threat. It was likely that nearly all of the upper echelons of government lay entombed in the annihilated megacity. If that was the case, anyone could be calling the shots now. "Good God," the president said, thinking about the magnitude of the fallout. "There's more, ma'am," the chief of staff said with a trembling voice. She looked back up at the president, who returned her gaze with an exhausted expression. Hillary had never seen her commander-in-chief look like this, and it made her even more nervous. The president could barely think. Martial law had been declared in every urban center above 500,000 residents, and evacuations had been ordered. Furthermore, the Department of Defense had just informed her about the hammer. "Yes?" Julia asked. "Well, DOD thinks that if the hammer doesn't work, that you might need to evacuate," Hillary replied, turning to receive a folder from an aide. "Evacuate?" Julia laughed, though there was no humor in her tone. "Where is there to evacuate to?" Hillary stared at her for a moment in silence. "Off the planet," the chief of staff replied. The president was a calm and soft-spoken woman, but this was the straw that broke her back. She felt rage filling her, but who she wanted to use it on wasn't clear. It was too late to save it from bubbling over. "Don't you dare suggest that I will abandon anything. Not until we've exhausted every alternative will I even consider it." She paused, inhaling deeply, regaining her composure. "Maybe, not even then," Julia spoke softly. The door to the Situation Room opened, and the Secretary of Defense and a pair of officers that the president didn't recognize walked in. Judging by the 6 stars they boasted between them, Julia decided that they must be generals. The SecDef coughed and said, "Madam President, may I introduce you to Generals McNulty and Christensen, the operations leads for the Hammer project." The two generals offered greetings. Half-hearted handshakes were exchanged. Then there was a brief pause while both sides waited for the other to speak first. After a moment, the president said, "So, gentlemen, the Chinese just launched more than half of their nuclear arsenal. Add that to the fact that we've lost more military hardware in the last 5 hours than we lost in the last 3 wars combined. Tell me exactly how you think what you have to offer will be any better." The room was silent as the generals glanced at each other. General Christian shifted uncomfortably. McNulty opened his mouth to speak, but a voice across the room cut him off. "We just lost San Francisco," a man in a uniform with a colonel insignia said. No one spoke. Julia's mind simply went numb. It was like someone had shut off every internal process. This couldn't be real. Then, McNulty spoke, almost mercifully breaking the silence that had enshrouded the room. "Because, frankly, Madam President, it looks like we are running out of options." Julia Edwards nodded, suddenly feeling exhausted beyond measure. "Fine, activate it. And take those sons of bitches down," she said. The two generals nodded. Christensen pulled out a datapad and began furiously typing. His orders were relayed to an intimidatingly large satellite dish, which in turn broadcast them into the morning skies. Far above the Situation Room, a series of engines sprung to life. Lights flickered on, and batteries began charging. The lunar surface began to tremble, and small pebbles danced across the surface. The shaking intensified until the very surface began to shift. Nearby, a single white dome reflected brilliant sunshine. An American flag was painted on its surface. At the center of the activity, a line appeared in the lunar crust. Slowly, 2 giant steel doors began to slide open, causing a shower of debris to fall into the darkened interior of the growing chasm. Then, from the darkness, a massive barrel appeared. It rose like a monolith above the harsh lunar surface. A dozen miles of electromagnetic coils buried beneath the surface, prepared to be used for their destructive purpose. The hammer was fully charged. The author's name and the link to original text is in the description. Consider tapping the thumbs up and pressing the subscribe button if you enjoyed this video.